So, Anita, welcome. Thank you so much for sitting down with me to talk about First Ladies today. When I thought about who I wanted to do this with, I knew it was you because you have such a strong background, both from experience and also from research as the director of the First Ladies Initiative at American University. But before that, in the White House, now you're the former chief of staff for First Lady Laura Bush. And so I wanted to talk with you about in particular, that office, the office of the First Lady, and how that really got started.
Well, thank you very much, Gwen, for having me. I'm really honored to be here and be sitting amongst these beautiful portraits of First Ladies. They help to tell our American story, and it's a privilege to be learning about them and talking about them. But the office of the First Lady, the modern office of the First Lady, as we know it today, we really have First Lady Rosalind Carter to thank for that. When she came to Washington with her husband in 1977, one of the first things that President Carter wanted to do was establish the President's Commission on Mental Health. It would mirror what he had established in Georgia as the Governor's Commission on Mental Health. That Rosalind Carter, as First Lady of Georgia, was the chair and deeply involved in the substance. She had a great background and history of working on mental health issues. But when they came to Washington with this idea of establishing the National Commission, they ran into obstacles because at the time, the laws around personnel for the White House did not authorize for members of the president's family to have official positions. And so, with working with the lawyers, working with the Office of Legal Counsel, the Department of Justice, the actual Personnel Authorization Act of 1977 established a new framework in the White House that established an office of the First Lady, where members of that office were actually considered staff of the president, but assigned to the First Lady's office. She was the first to hire a policy director. She expanded the size of the staff and really worked very closely with the president's office on initiatives that supported his administration.
And the foundations that Mrs. Carter finds when she comes to the White House, the foundations for a First Lady's office, had really been laid very much earlier, far earlier in the century by women like Edith Roosevelt, who comes into the White House and finds that it just doesn't really work for her family. Can you say something about that?
Right, absolutely. When Edith Roosevelt, comes in with President Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, they have a large family, a large young family. And up to that point, the president's office and his home were all in the same space in the residence of the White House, the second floor, as we know it, above the state floor. It's a beautiful space, but really not large enough to accommodate a large family, as well as all of the president's staff, his office, and all of the people that were coming and going. So Edith Roosevelt had enormous impact on the White House, both how the staff works and how the family lives, because she moved all those staff members and the president out of the residence, out of the second floor. The West Wing of the White House was built at that time. The staff of the president moved over outside of the residence and began to work in separate space. And it allowed, for her family to really have a home. And so all first families that followed really have Edith Roosevelt to thank for changing the landscape, if you will, and changing the environment in which the family could live and have privacy and have space to be a family, have family dinners together and have their own bedrooms and not have staff coming and going, or at least working staff. The other thing, too, as a busy mother with a social obligations as well as First Lady of the United States, she was the first to hire a social secretary handling the planning and the schedule around the social events that come with the job. So she left a mark on both how the family lives, but how the staff works, and how the First Lady really was able to manage the social obligations of the role.
Well, and I understand that the social secretary helped out in the portrait that we have on display here. It's a beautiful portrait by Cecilia Beau, and it shows Edith Roosevelt and her daughter Ethel. But Edith was very busy. Mrs. Roosevelt had, a busy schedule, and so
Right.
sometimes during the sittings,
Right.
her secretary would stand in for her, or sit in for her during
Right.
the portrait.
Right. And that completely, underscores really what a close staff member or close confidant of anyone who's, working for a principal will step in to do to help the person that they're working for be able to do their job. And even if that meant standing in to for the portrait artist so that it could be completed, on time or in a reasonable amount of time. It's a beautiful portrait of a mother and young daughter, the youngest daughter of the Roosevelts, of course, because President Roosevelt had his daughter Alice from his first marriage. So yes, that Isabella Hagner, who was the social secretary that was hired, was very close to Mrs. Roosevelt and really handled many personal things for her as well as official duties.
That impact on the White House, with every family coming in, changing a little bit, sometimes the grounds, sometimes the private spaces. The portrait of Lady Bird Johnson, for example, which shows her in this beautiful yellow gown with the Jefferson Memorial over her shoulder, behind her. That's a piece that has been displayed in the Vermeer Room. Can you speak to the way that space, the Vermeer Room, has changed over the years?
Sure. The May room is just a beautiful room, of course, on the ground floor of the White House. When people come in for tours, they'll see that room. It's one of the first rooms, on the left. You could peek in and see these beautiful portraits, and the portrait, of course, of Mrs. Johnson that hangs on the west wall when she's in a beautiful yellow gown, and she liked the color yellow because it conveyed a sense of optimism. And
Like sunshine for a
like
new day.
sunshine, absolutely. And after, thinking about, of course, when the Johnsons came into the White House, that was after a period of tremendous national grief for the country after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Mrs. Johnson really exuded a warmth, a strength, a resilience, but an incredible sense of compassion as well. And we have her to thank for being one of our nation's first conservationists, First Lady, I think is a fair way to describe her. She really championed the Highway Beautification Act signed by her husband, very, very focused on what our natural landscape is in our country, how beautiful it is, how it should be protected, how different it was from state to state. And she wanted Americans to have pride in the beauty of our nation. And she spent, a considerable amount of time as First Lady. And then also when she left to go back home, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas is really a wonderful museum and place of beauty of our natural abundance of native plants and how they contribute to the beauty of our nation.
Well, today we don't realize what the sides of the road used to look like. That there used to be all of these signs that would be placed and advertisements, and people would throw their Coke bottles out the window
right.
as they were zipping down the road.
That's right.
And she was very outspoken about, not littering and that we should, as you said, take pride in these spaces. But then the wildflowers being planted on the sides of the roads. And I used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, and in the springtime, all of these bulbs would come up along the side of the Interstate 40 and the 44. And it was just stunning. And I had no idea.
Really her connection to that, honestly, throughout our nation's highways. And, her experience of being the wife of a congressman, because Lyndon Johnson, of course, was from Congress, from Texas, The Johnsons lived in Northwest Washington in the Spring Valley area for a good portion of that time, and she would drive to Texas, to the home district, and she would see the conditions of our highways, and so the littering that you mentioned, and so she felt a real responsibility to do something about it. As you know, most first ladies bring a passion that they have into the White House, into this opportunity that they have with this very powerful platform to make something happen and to get something done. So she has a direct impact on the beauty that you saw along the roads in Missouri as well as people see all over the nation. And the one other point I'll bring about the Vermeer Room that you asked and where her portrait is, years later when Laura Bush was First Lady, she loved Lady Bird Johnson. Of course, the Texas, First Ladies felt a bond with each other, Barbara Bush, Laura Bush, and Lady Bird Johnson. But Laura Bush had the color of the walls in the Vermeer Room really painted to be perfectly complementary to Mrs. Johnson's beautiful portrait that hangs there on the west wall in the Vermeer Room. And Mrs. Bush went through various iterations of paint colors with the residence painter, Cletus Clark, who had been a member of the resident staff, who was the lead painter. And he came up with various different color samples until Mrs. Bush said that's the perfect one. And it really complemented Mrs. Johnson's portrait beautifully. It also complemented Jackie Kennedy's portrait, which of course hangs in the south wall, which is the most visible one to anyone walking by the open door of the Vermeer Room. So it's really quite a beautiful room. It is sunny and optimistic in that room, and a perfect setting for Mrs. Johnson's portrait, which Laura Bush got to show to Mrs. Johnson when
Really?
she came. Yes. In the fall of 2005, we had heard from Linda Johnson Robb that she was bringing her mother to Washington, which would arguably be her last visit, to visit some friends here in Washington that were still alive. And so she brought Mrs. John, asked if she could bring her mother to the White House. And of course, Mrs. Bush said yes. She was excited to greet her, and greeted her at the diplomatic reception room doors, and actually had the houseman at the time who had served as a houseman during the Johnson's administration, Mr. Wilson German, who was still alive and was working part-time at the White House. Mrs. Bush had asked him to greet Mrs. Johnson at the door when she arrived. And Mrs. Johnson, of course, had had a series of strokes, was no longer speaking, but she recognized Mr. German right away, and her eyes lit up and they fell into each other's arms. And it was really a very moving moment. Again, this connection of these families who live there and the staff that have worked for them, the resident staff in particular that served so many administrations. But the first thing Laura Bush did was wheel Mrs. Johnson in her wheelchair into the Vermeer Room and brought her in front of her portrait. And she said, "Now, Lady Bird, I have this room repainted to just have your portrait look so beautiful here where it is. I mean, the color of the walls painted to really complement your beautiful portrait." And it was a very sweet moment.
That's so nice. The connections between these women across generations, I think, is really powerful. And, as you mentioned with the staff in the White House, sometimes those working relationships were really good, and other times not so good. I know with the Hoovers, for example, Lou Henry Hoover, who was a very serious scholar in her own right. She knew many languages. She was fluent in Cantonese. She had lived in different countries and was a geologist. And she came into the White House, and from what I read, she treated the staff, she wanted them to be invisible.
And that's very hard for the resident staff to be invisible. And they try really their best, of course, to give the family, a sense of privacy. Yet the spaces are small, so it's difficult, particularly if a first family doesn't like to see the resident staff around them. they do their best. The resident staff does their best to remain as invisible as possible, but it's not, it's not always easy.
It's infrequent that the general public has an opportunity to glimpse the private quarters of the White House, but every so often there's a television interview and the cameras get to go behind the scenes. And I was watching one of Betty Ford that she gave for 60 Minutes, and she was very frank about her life in the White House. And she really scandalized a lot of people when she spoke about her children, the possibility that they had had premarital sex. She was very open about the ERA. And then when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, she was very open about that. And these first interviews that came out from the private quarters, from the family spaces, really helped to personalize her. And she was able to make a connection with the American people.
Betty Ford is an extraordinary example of a first lady using her platform to create such incredible change in our country. When she went public with a very private disease, think about it, 1974, she had been first lady for just over 6 weeks, and it was less than 2 months, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Really, the word breast was not mentioned in public by women, and certainly the stigma of breast cancer impacted women's health and the way they were treated, the way it was diagnosed, the way it was handled. Her going very public with her mastectomy and her recovery and allowing herself to even be photographed, at Bethesda Naval Hospital in her hospital room with her husband and Bob Hope, who had come, to visit her. That was such bravery and courage to share that with the American people, and particularly women. And she changed the nature of and the face of how women's health really was handled from that period forward. So extraordinary implications for her forthrightness, her courage, her candor, and she was just very real in the things that she cared about. Yes, the ERA, she was the mother of of teenagers in the White House and attuned with sort of the shifting social changes going on in our country. So that may have been shocking to some, but with Betty Ford, what she had to say is what people needed to hear. And I think throughout her whole life, she shared her experiences and personal challenges to help people. And in fact, when she died, in President Obama's comments about her being courageous to talk about substance abuse and addiction, and how that changed our country as well on how we handle, respond to, and treat people with these diseases. So she's a wonderful activist, first lady, but also was a wonderful mother and an incredibly supportive wife to her husband, and did everything she could to help him, and really was a fierce campaigner for him in 1976 when he was running for election, his first election, of course, as president. And people do think to this day that if she'd been deployed even a little bit more to Ohio and other states, it might have had a different result in the 1976 election that Jimmy Carter won, because that was a very close election.
So we have a number of campaign buttons in the exhibition, these little mini portraits that you could wear on your lapel, on your sweater, to show, to speak for you without actually having to open your mouth, who you supported. And the ones of first ladies, as opposed to the ones of presidents, really speak to the way that the first lady had become a kind of a running mate. Betty for first lady, for Betty Ford, and thinking about the ways that first ladies either were not, that visible in their husbands' campaigns, or more recently, really becoming a serious asset for them.
Well, that's true. And starting, really with Eleanor Roosevelt, who really spoke at the Democratic National convention for her husband. Barbara Bush in later years was the first to really deliver a keynote address at a convention. First ladies, although they are not the elected official or running for office, they are, seen as a partner to the president. And they are often the ones that their images or their interviews or their public, remarks convey another side of the president and the partnership, between them. And so they can sometimes be even more popular than the candidate themselves, and that's fair, but also understandable in the fact that all the responsibilities and difficult decisions fall upon a president of the United States, where a first lady gets to pick and choose how she wants to deploy her influence and how she wants to be public and active. And people connect with that. They connect with the human side of the spouse of the president.
I think it's safe to say that every first lady has an impact on the White House, from Edith Roosevelt making the decision to hang the portraits of the first lady around the house so that people could see them and see her also, to a first lady like Jacqueline Kennedy, who comes in and finds a White House that has actually had so many impacts on it that it's really been transformed, and she's instrumental in changing that, isn't she?
Jacqueline Kennedy probably had the most enduring impact on the White House as we know it now, as a museum, as a place of curatorial excellence, in addition to being a place where the president works and lives. She had an expansive knowledge of history and loved the country, loved the education that should go along with telling our story as a nation, particularly to the nation's young people. She wanted Americans to feel connected to the White House and have pride in the White House. And so when she came in as a young First Lady, 32 years old, and one of the early things, it's very young, and a young mother.
And to understand history like that.
And just it had been her passion. And of course, and as a young mother. So she was, a busy young mom in the White House. But what she did was take that real interest in our history, in our nation's history, and also took an experience that she had as a young girl visiting the White House with her mother for a tour of the White House, and that there was no guidebook. There was nothing telling you about the rooms that you were in and the people who had lived there, the families, the presidents, the first ladies who had lived there. So we have her to thank for the establishing the White House Historical Association as a private arm, a partner to the White House, so that the education of the White House, the preservation, the acquisitions of artifacts that should belong to the White House collection, that would happen. She also established the Office of the Curator, working together with the First Lady and working with a private committee, the Committee for Preservation of the White House, which was some of the nation's most foremost experts on architecture and on restoration and on history. They worked together with her and with the financial support of the Historical Association, which was established, now going into its 60th year, that will preserve the museum quality of the White House and acquire artifacts and things that belong to the White House collection, restore some of the beautiful historical pieces like the Belanger suite in the Blue Room, which is iconic, the furniture that had been purchased by President Monroe. So we really have her to thank, her love of history, her love of education, and wanting to share it for generations to come. So her impact is deeply felt and always will be, thanks to her leadership in protecting the White House as a museum.
A number of the first ladies have been writers, starting with Louisa Adams, who wrote Adventures of a Nobody, her autobiography. And then often we think about Eleanor Roosevelt and the 27 different books that she wrote and the newspaper column that she wrote, My Day, Every Day. And then there are first ladies who are interested in literacy. And Barbara Bush, I think it was so important the way that she championed literacy. And the portrait that we have hanging of her in the exhibition, which is on loan from the White House, in the frame, in the four corners of the frame, are little books. And it was such a nice touch when we spotted that. I was like, oh my gosh, this really emphasizes her interest in literacy.
Yes, absolutely. And you think about first ladies in our history and their love of reading and literature and books. And Abigail Fillmore, of course, the first lady to establish an actual research library for the White House. On the ground floor, the White House is the little White House library,
That
and
was
we
her.
really have her
Did
to
it come out
thank.
of her inheritance
It
from her
did.
father? That was like really the only thing that was left to her were her
That's
father's books.
that's exactly right. Her father had been a minister, had left her his collection of books, and that's her, her first little library, and that was one of her impacts on the White House, is establishing the White House Library. And then, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, as you had mentioned, what a master communicator. Not only her daily column, My Day, but her weekly Sunday radio broadcasts. In fact, she was the first voice that Americans heard on December 7th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Of course, the president had issued a statement earlier in the day, a press release, but she, in her weekly Sunday, 6:30 p.m. Coffee hours with the American public, she talked about what had just happened to us and the strength and resolve we all needed to have, and that this was going to be a difficult effort, but we would get through it together. She also established the Office of Presidential Correspondence at the White House. She encouraged Americans to write to their president and to write to her. In fact, my first job in the White House in 1984 was in presidential correspondence, reading presidential mail, and I was trained by a woman who was hired in the last year of FDR's administration. She'd been reading mail all that time. That connection to Americans and writing to your president really was a lot directly linked to her and her advocacy. And then in later years, of course, you mentioned Barbara Bush. Barbara Bush established the Literacy Foundation, Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. It's now in its 30th year. That was legislation, actually the National Literacy Act that was passed in 1990 was legislation that President Bush's administration worked on with the Congress, but the champion, of course, was Barbara Bush. She really believed that families that read together not only created this bond for their family life, but that the people needed to be able to read and to write, and this is how the biggest problems in the world could be solved, if people could read, write, and comprehend. And so her legacy of that foundation that exists still to this day, very much focused on improving literacy throughout our nation, which is still at numbers that are unacceptable. But it's nice that you noticed that frame around her beautiful portrait that had those 4 books, because it's one of the subtle touches that directly connects Barbara Bush to what she will be always remembered for, is her love of literature and books and reading.
And also with Laura Bush. In the portrait of Laura Bush, she's seated very comfortably and she has a book in her hands, open, as though we've walked into the room and interrupted her in the middle of a good read.
Yeah, it's a beautiful portrait, a very serene portrait of Laura Bush, which really conveys her personality. It's, calm and strong, and loved books, loved words, loved literature. And of course, as First Lady of Texas, she established the Texas Book Festival that is still going on. The National Book Festival that just had its 20th year. Literacy was her passion. She was a teacher. She was a librarian. She brought those interests to the White House. And the portrait that you have of her that was done in 2008, just as the Bushes were leaving the White House, is one of her favorite places in the White House, the West Sitting Hall, and the afternoon sun that comes through that beautiful Palladian window. And it's in the private space, and it's where she loved to sit and to read. And when her her late afternoons, when some of her official schedule was done, and before the president would come home, this was her quiet time, and where she would say later too in her memoirs that, you know, reading not only was her passion, but also something that she had learned, you know, from her mother. And when she would come home from school, she would see her mother sitting, you know, and reading a book. So it really conveyed the continuity of, you know, love of reading, love of literature throughout her life.
In the exhibition, we have a number of garments, including the dress by designer Michelle Smith of Millie that is worn in our portrait of Mrs. Obama. There's a suit that was sewn for Jacqueline Kennedy by Shani Non. And then we have a gown that Mrs. Reagan wore, that Nancy Reagan wore at the second inauguration. This is one of the garments, the few garments that she actually wore twice, because she also wore it to receive their Royal Highnesses, Prince Charles and Princess Diana, when they came to the White House. And it was such a, I remember as a young girl seeing this, it was such an amazing evening because Princess Diana danced with John Travolta. It was a really great night. But Mrs. Reagan was really known for fashion and for clothing and for her red dresses. And red was her signature color.
Right. Well, Mrs. Reagan, of course, was an actress. She had in her prior life, of course, and had that sense of style, sense of couture, and really brought that elegance, you know, with her and her signature style, including wearing red, to the White House. It's a color she loved to see herself in. Her beautiful portrait that hangs also in the Vermeer Room at the White House, and now, at least at the time of when we were in the administration. Now I believe it's in the ground floor corridor in the East Wing.
This is the portrait by Erin Schickler,
The Erin
who
Schickler
also
portrait.
did the portrait that we have from Time Magazine that's on view.
That's right, and really captures, you know, her and her elegance, and of course in her signature color. Her inaugural gown, yes, as you say, she wore it twice, was quite beautiful and elegant, and really seeing it on display, you're reminded of what a tiny person, you know, Nancy Reagan
But the perfect size too. And that dress, I asked the textile conservators when
Yes,
they were unpacking
right.
it weighs almost 20 pounds.
It is, you know, exactly. I mean, with all the beading and, you know, it's so heavy, but it looks so effortless, or she carried it so effortlessly, of course, on inauguration night of 1985. And remember, that was the inauguration that was canceled earlier in the day. The weather in Washington had been so bitterly cold, so the inauguration ceremony at the Capitol, the parade, all those things had been canceled, but the evening balls did go on, of course, because they were indoors. So it was just as, you know, a spectacular view for people to have of the Reagans, because they were really deprived of it, you know, earlier in the day. But it is really something when you see sort of the clothing of personal artifacts of the First Ladies and what they've worn, the capelet that you have of Mrs. Lincoln's, and you can picture them in this. It just gives you, you know, a sense of who they are, their personalities. And again, I just think, you know, we want to feel a personal connection to our presidents and our first families. And one of the most direct ways to do that is through the president's spouse.
Well, I hope that when people come to the exhibit, they get that personal connection and that sense of how important these women were, how different they were, and how their lives really, you know, do mirror the history of this country.
They absolutely do. I mean, this is an important part of telling our nation's story, is through all of those who have had the privilege and honor really to be in public life and serving the American people. And we want to know as much, or we should want to know as much as we can about them and their complicated lives and complex stories, particularly our early first ladies and our early first families, and who some were slaveholders, of course, and some had slaves in the White House. And we really try to, at the White House Historical Association, to tell that story of slavery in the president's neighborhood and some of the early occupants of the White House. But our nation continues to evolve, as it should, continues to be more inclusive in telling our full story. And an exhibit like this, really, and the narrative that you've at least captured for each person, they want you to investigate more in who they were, what their backgrounds were, how they came to be in this position in public life, what they did with it, what they've left behind, what we can learn from them, and how we move forward as a country.
Thank you so much, Anita. This has
Thank
been
you.
wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor. I appreciate it.